This meeting is being recorded.
Good evening, everybody. It is Thursday, April 21st, 5 p.m. This is Chair Greg Hooksma of the Gig Harbor Planning Commission. I am calling our meeting to order. First order of business is roll call. Commissioner Brown.
Here.
Commissioner Greina.
Here.
Commissioner Bennett.
Here.
Commissioner Krozik.
Here.
Commissioner Soltis.
Here.
And Commissioner Bradbury. He's not here yet, so Michelle, if you'll just make a note of when he joins the meeting, I'd appreciate that. Also, from the city staff, we have Jeremy Hammer. Hello, Jeremy. Good to see you. Sort of meet you.
Nice to meet all of you. It's my first one of these.
And Carl DeSimas. And as always, Michelle Thomas, who makes everything work. And then it looks like we also have some folks from the community here. So welcome to all of you. Just as a reminder to you, we're glad that you are here, but there will not be a public hearing as part of this. So please do not raise your hand or participate in any chats during the meeting because you won't be allowed to speak. Okay. So moving along in the agenda, we need approval of the minutes from our last meeting. If there are no corrections or notes about them. I'm willing to entertain a motion.
We approve.
Commissioner Brown moves to approve,
A second.
seconded by Commissioner Bennett. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Okay. Well, let's dig right in, Carl. With what we hope to be our last substantive discussion anyway of short-term rentals and the new ordinance here for the city of Gig Harbor. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Carl.
Zoom, personal, Microsoft Edge.
Okay, thanks, Chair. So we're coming at this here from another angle this time, sort of similar to what we tried to do at our last meeting in looking at sort of the potential short-term rental regulations and trying to sort of suss out where we have questions, where we have concerns, or where there are options that we need to address. And so what we've done here, and we've worked with the chair on this to kind of come up with maybe a cleaner format and an easier way to organize sort of the overarching questions that we think are the items that need to be addressed in order for us to put together a draft ordinance ultimately for review. And it does seem to boil down to just a few questions, about 20 or so questions that we think if we can get concrete answers on, that it will help us essentially write the ordinance. The ordinance will from that point kind of write itself. And then of course there will need to be some minor tweaks and things that we'll have to look at and maybe make some changes to, which we can do at our hopefully at our next meeting. So can everybody see the screen or see the table that I've pulled up here? Is it clear to everybody? Anything I need to do? Change that? Okay. So what we've done is we've put together this table where we've got a topic and question in one column. We have some discussion items in the middle column. And then as we're going through this, I will just type out the result for each question in the third column. And then we can, Jeremy and myself and Michelle can take all of those answers, go back to the drawing board and draft up some regulations to bring back for Planning Commission's review. Chair, do you want to add anything to that, or does that sound like a good plan moving this forward?
Yeah, and I just would like to emphasize a little bit there, something you alluded to, and that is that we've had a lot of discussion, and so what we decided to do was to, put some items in there, as you'll see as we work through it, that things that we think we've reached consensus or close to consensus on, and if not, things that bear further discussion. But I think that we should be able to move through this in an efficient manner based on our previous work.
Yeah, agreed. And also just like to acknowledge the work that the Planning Commission has done to this point, and all of the documentation and materials and research that you guys have done and submitted to staff to in this effort. It has really just, I think, been amazing how much effort and work and thought you guys put into this. And I think we're going to, end up with a really solid result because of it. So anyway, let's just jump in then here on number one. And I think the way I'll do it, Chair, is I'll just read it. I'll read the discussion piece, and then I'll turn it over to you guys on each item. And I will, when we get to some sort of consensus, I can just put that result in. Does that sound good?
Sure.
Okay. So the first item is how should the city permit short-term rentals? We talked about this at previous meetings. At the last meeting, we landed on potentially a short-term rental that is a short-term rental permit that is specific to that use of a single-family dwelling unit, and likely one that would be considered a type 2 permit, because there's interest by the Planning Commission to have noticing of these of the application. A type 2 permit gives us that. But there was also some consensus, I think, on the Planning Commission's part to have it be a process that is not so arduous that nobody wants to enter into the permitting process. And some might consider that to be true of a conditional use permit process, where it ends up having to go to the hearing examiner for a decision. In this case, with the type 2 permit, it would be the decision would be made administratively, be made by the director. And it is still appealable, and there is still a notice of application up front. So people get to get their input into the process. And if they don't like the decision, then there is an appeal process on the back end as well.
So Carl, could you just add delineate what all the pieces are? I think that type 2, as I recall, means that they would also have to post one of those big orange boards outside their home for some period of time. So obviously the neighbor would be aware, and I think that would also allow anyone in the neighborhood to provide input to the city staff.
Yeah, that's correct, Chair. That would be part of the noticing. So there would be a notice of application. So it'd be a comment period of not less than 14 days for folks to get their comments in to the city in written form. There would be a board posted on the site. Both of those things, and that notice would go out to folks within 300 feet of the site as well. And if the decision is appealed, it would go to the hearing examiner for an appeal hearing.
Okay, thanks. All right, and if it's not too much trouble, if we could swap back and forth between screen sharing and not screen sharing, so as we have our discussion, yeah, there we go.
Mr. Chairman, I like the concept that we've outlined here. I think this is fair and reasonable for both the owners and the surrounding properties. The only thing I was wondering about, is there any way to have a smaller sign? That big orange sign is going to look pretty obnoxious on somebody's lawn.
Well, that's a really good question, Commissioner Croslick. I don't think we could do anything. That's our standard. That's the standard size we use for all projects, and I don't know that we could do something different. It would also, we have templates sort of set up for those signs as well, so we'd have to set up a whole new template for this one, and I don't know. I can see Michelle grinding her jaw right now as we're talking about this, because she's the one who has to deal with trying to get those things printed up and stuff. So, while
And it's not a problem.
Mhm.
I think we can make them smaller too, because it's not in code what size they have to be.
I think that, so I guess if that's the answer, it's something we could look into.
Yep, be very easy.
Okay, good, thanks. Commissioner Grina?
I wondered is there an application fee associated with that permit?
Yes, there would be, Commissioner Grina, but it would be something that would have to be set by council.
Okay.
But there would be an application fee, absolutely. So we would look at that as part of the ordinance. We'd have to update our fee schedule.
Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Bennett?
I'm just kind of curious what the purpose of the public comment period would be. If you're putting a notice out to the neighbors within 300 or 500 feet, what would you be looking to get from a public comment period? You're looking for anyone in general who has a comment, and then where do the comments go, and who makes the decision on what happens with those comments?
So a really good question, Commissioner Bennett. So the comments would come to the planning division. So we would receive those comments during that period. We would compile them, and we would provide those comments then back to the applicant so that they're aware. And we would use those comments as part of our decision-making process. So in other words, if there are substantive comments brought forward, or substantive concerns, then we would analyze those to see if there is any way to condition those issues as part of the permit, and or ask the applicant to potentially mitigate those items, and or provide explanation as to how they would address it. Oftentimes the comments we get are sort of NIMBY comments, that somebody just doesn't want it. And people can certainly make those comments, but those aren't very helpful. So what we're really looking for are kind of substantive comments. Oftentimes, on a site plan or something, maybe there's a stream or a wetland that we were unaware of on the site, and that might get brought to our attention by someone commenting. Of course, that wouldn't happen in this case, or it wouldn't matter necessarily. But there could be something that's brought up that we're unaware of, or maybe there's some nuisance concern that we hadn't considered that maybe we could address.
That sounds fair.
Hey, Carl, I'm sorry, you're finished, Amanda? Thanks. What redress would the applicant have, Carl, if the staff denied the permit and they felt that, well, they didn't agree with it and want to push the issue?
They could also appeal that decision to the hearing examiner.
Okay. All right.
Chair, there's one question on this, and Carl, with you as well. Is this the point you'd want to talk about streamlining the application process to maybe put it on a web-based kind of application, or is that another place for this discussion?
No, I think this is probably the right place for that.
Because we've heard a lot we heard something from some people that were quite concerned about the length and the arduousness of this process that we have in place today. It sounds like this would be faster and easier, but are we still in the paper and pencil process for applications like this, or is it time to move forward into the 21st century, Michelle?
We do everything electronically now. We have very, very few paper submittals.
So yeah, so we do take all electronic submittals, and there are, and folks can access our permit tracking software via a portal, so they can track the process as well. Yeah, a type 2 permit should move faster than a type 3 permit, and I would also say that a type 2 permit for something like this probably moves faster than a type 2 permit for a commercial site plan, for instance, or preliminary, or not preliminary plat, type 3, or potentially some other type of type 2 permit that can't quite put my finger on, but let's just say site plan. But that's not to say that it will, right? I mean, it could get bogged down for any number of reasons in the permitting process. That's very possible. So, there are other ways to handle it. I mean, if we decided we didn't want to use a permit or a formal land use permit at all, I mean, that is another possibility. There are other ways to handle this. I mean, it could be done through just a business license and registry, for instance, or a home occupation. Jeremy and I were kind of kicking that around earlier today, that short-term rentals act a little bit like a home occupation as well. It doesn't meet the definition of a home occupation exactly, and there are some other provisions in our home occupation code that wouldn't line up very well with short-term rental. But that could be another way to handle it if the Planning Commission wanted to look at not using a typical land use permit to allow these. We've gone down this road because it seemed like this is the way that the Planning Commission was kind of leaning, and some jurisdictions have leaned this way as well, but there are some jurisdictions that have not. I think, Jeremy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Bellevue just uses, they view them as a home occupation.
Correct.
Typically, home occupations aren't permitted. They're generally allowed. I don't know if Bellevue's doing it that way or not, but generally speaking, they're sort of reviewed as part of the business license application process.
No.
Bellevue's works, it's a home occupation permit, but it acts as a type 2 permit for what we have. They have a public notice period. And,
they do.
Yeah. So.
But the type 2 permit is nice because we get the notice of application, and we get you get the appeal built into it, which is.
I think, for me, I think unless someone's opposed, I feel best that this gives us the greatest visibility. It balances the needs on both sides, and I don't see. I think it's a nice middle of the road that keeps this visible to the city staff. It keeps it visible to the neighborhood and allows a simplified process for interested parties to move forward with an application.
Agreed.
So everyone agree on that point?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, one down.
Right, here we go. Let me share the screen here really quick. I'll get faster at this too. Let's see. Maybe I shouldn't have been the one doing that. Okay, so I added in here, you'll see the result, smaller notice board question marks. That's something that we can certainly look at when we get into the process. Type 2 permit. I think that sums it up pretty well. Number 2, how often should an STR permit then be renewed? So if we are creating a permit that's specific to STRs, we wouldn't normally have a renewal process for, let's say, a site plan permit or something like that. Once it's approved, there's Commissioner Bradbury. Once it's approved, then that permit sort of runs with the land. And so there wouldn't be necessarily a renewal. We would be looking at it again when maybe there was a site plan amendment or some change that was needed out there. But in this case, where we have a required business license renewal process, so every business license needs to be looked at and renewed annually. That seems to be potentially the best way to sort of touch and keep these in check on an annual basis.
Okay, discussion. Commissioner Krosick. You're muted, John.
Sorry about that. I like the idea of an annual renewal with a modest renewal fee, because I think we probably want to know if people are staying in this business, so that if somebody decides they don't want to do this anymore, that will give us a way of capturing that information, and then maybe we can grant a permit to somebody else who would like to do it. So I'm good with annual renewals.
Commissioner Soltis.
I wasn't quite sure whether would there be an initial business license issued along with a short-term rental permit?
Yeah, so I think the way it would work is they would maybe they would come in for their business license first, not knowing that they need a short-term rental permit, and that would go through the city clerk and then down to Michelle, who reviews all of our business licenses. She would catch it, flag it, and
Actually go through DOR.
but then they're submitted to the city through the clerk, right?
DOR submits them to us, yeah.
So we would catch it and flag it at that point, and we would let the applicant know that they're going to need a short-term rental permit. So that would kick off the process for the short-term rental permit. As a condition of approval of that short-term rental permit, we would require that the applicant get a valid business license with the city and state.
Okay, so they need both then. They need a business license and a short-term rental. And
Yes.
then you'd renew it, the short-term rental license, just like it's a business license.
Yep, we would renew it annually, but we would be looking at certain criteria within this short-term rental code that we're writing, that they would be needing to meet those criteria, and showing that there haven't been any violations. Well, there's other items within this list that we're going to get to that I think would be sort of checks, things that we would be checking for in order to renew that business license. They would have to be in compliance with.
So you said something in there, Carl, that one thing I want to specifically ensure doesn't happen is that the permit runs with, you said runs with the land. And so I don't, like, if there is a sale of a home, it is my opinion that the permit should die at that time, and a new owner would be required to get a new permit.
Okay. I don't have an answer for that right off the top of my head. I don't think that that's something that we couldn't do. It seems like something that we could build into this ordinance, but I would have to I'd have to check that through legal for sure. But I can certainly, well, in fact, let's just add it in, and I'll add it back into
Well, that's one man's opinion. What do the rest of you think?
oh, sorry.
Well, I concur with that opinion, Greg.
Same
And
here.
I do as well.
So it should be issued to the current property owner only.
Right. It's issued to an individual, not the. And I suppose that there's at least a protection that with an annual renewal, is that someone comes back in and says, I'm renewing, like, wait a minute, who are you?
Yeah.
But I don't think that should be the only safeguard. I think we can build into the ordinance that it's that the permit and the license are issued to the individual, not to the property.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll have to, yeah, we'll do some looking into that as well when we're drafting this up, and make sure that we're not barking up the wrong tree with the type 2 permit as a result of that.
Okay, all right, thanks. All right. Back to screen share.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so I think the answer to number 2 was just yes. Okay, so
Zoom magnifier reader, zoom level 12.
number 3, the city notices that's conditional use permit applications to all property owners within 300 feet of the site. And the question is this an adequate notice area? So there was some discussion previously about noticing and whether or not we should be noticing further afield than 300 feet, potentially 500 feet. I think that's something we could look at doing. You know, our standard notice is 300 feet, and much of our noticing is captured in actually in Title 19. It's not in Title 17 where this ordinance is going to live. So that would be something that would be specific to this permit application if we were to go more than 300 feet. And so that could potentially necessitate code changes we would need to make in Title 19 as well. So it might have tendrils, I guess is what I'm saying.
Okay. Discussion? Commissioner
I
Soltis?
think 300 feet is adequate. That would probably be at least 6 houses to either side of the affected property.
If it's helpful, I do have an exhibit that shows 300 feet, what that looks like.
Oh, great.
Find it.
It kind of looks like a football field, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it depends on the size of the parcel because we go 300 feet from each parcel boundary. So if it's a weird shaped parcel, it'll be a weird shaped 300 feet.
Try this again here. Here's 3. Is that my 300? It is my 300. Okay, there's 300 feet. This is Ross Avenue. So Harbor View down here. So this touches. Sorry.
Can you pinch that out so it fills up more of the screen, please?
Let's see. Do that.
There we go. Thank you.
So it hits on Novak from, this is sort of Ross and just off of Dorotich, and makes its way, you know, up Dorotich almost to the church, picks up part of the, well, just to the church really.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what 300 feet would look like.
So do you have, so those are about the skinniest lots in all of Gig Harbor though. Do you width-wise, do you have a similar view that of, you know, a less densely populated area? Or well, I guess it's the same, different way of saying it, but area where the width of the lots is more significant?
I think I do. One moment.
And Commissioner Soltis, did you want to make your comment while Carl's doing that?
Oh, I was going to say that I thought 300 was fine.
Well, that's in the shoreline, so that's not as quite as helpful.
Hey, that's my house. Yeah, in that picture, not the orange box.
Yeah, I didn't think so. Yeah, I didn't think that was yours. Let me see if I can find where's this one at. That's a pretty skinny lot too, but the other lots around it are not quite the same dimension.
I'm happy with 300 feet as well.
This is a larger shaped lot here. It's kind of over by the school in Finholm there.
Yeah. Well, I think in all these cases that you're capturing a number of people, you know, it looks like maybe a minimum of 10, and people are going to go door knocking if they are upset about these sorts of things. And so word will get around.
Yeah, we've found that 300 feet works pretty well, you know, in our experience. And I think that's pretty typical. Most jurisdictions, I think.
Okay, so it sounds like 3 folks have chimed in on being comfortable with 300 feet.
I agree with 300. That's fine with me.
I do too.
Okay,
I do as well.
all right then, 300 it is.
Perfect. All right, look how fast I'm getting now at this. Number 4, owner occupied versus non-owner occupied. I think this one's sort of already settled, but we wanted to bring it up again just since we're going through these questions. It's one of the overarching questions that needs to be answered. Planning Commission at our last meeting was leaning towards prohibiting non-owner occupied short-term rentals. And so they would only be considered owner occupied. And then we'll talk about what owner occupied means in the next couple of items here on the table as well, but just owner occupied versus non-owner occupied.
Comments?
And maybe, Chair, maybe it's hard to have this discussion without talking about the next items. I don't know. If that's the case, then happy to come back to this one.
Commissioner Krosick?
Yeah, I am in agreement with prohibiting all non-owner occupied rentals.
I agree with that.
Commissioner Soltis?
I think this is one of the most critical issues that we're going to talk about on this whole topic. And I think it's going to cause us trouble if we try to blanketly prohibit non-owner occupied timeshares. And I guess another question in my mind is, if we prohibit it and they continue to do it, what's the city's options? Because I don't know that we're going to be able to control that. It would take a pretty big enforcement staff to track people down that are not paying attention to the rule. So I guess I'm kind of flummoxed by the whole issue. I mean, we can ban it, but it may still take place. And how do we deal with that? Are we ready to deal both directions? So I'd like to hear the comments of the other commissioners, because this could be actually put us in some in legal jeopardy. And one of the comments was, well, you know, better be careful about this one, because, you know, this could get you in trouble with the legalities. There is precedent for doing this. We all know that. We all did our research on this. There are a number of places that have flat out banned it. But, you know, are we at the point in Gig Harbor where we want to, you know, do that this early in the game? I'm just going to listen for a little bit longer. That's my comment for the moment.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Bennett?
I'm kind of in the same situation as Commissioner Soltis, kind of wondering, for me, I feel like I need the definition more of what owner occupied means. Does that mean flat out banning, say, myself from buying a property across town, not living there, but staying in my home and renting that out as an Airbnb on a weekly basis? That's what a non-owner occupied would be. Someone who lives in California buying a place up here and Airbnb-ing it. Is that what non-owner occupied is, or what we're defining it as?
Well, we haven't put any definition around it yet, Commissioner Bennett, and I think that's kind of maybe the crux of the issue, really, and that it does go to, and maybe Chair, if it's okay, let me bring the table back up, because I think maybe
Okay.
items should be talked about in tandem, it sounds like.
We might need to see the other questions and talk about those before coming back to that or something.
Zoom text magnifier reader, Zoom level 12.
So we're talking about number 4. I jumped the gun here. Talking about number 4, but number 5 is what is the minimum amount of time each year an owner must reside at the residence for it to be considered owner occupied. So if you'll recall, when we were talking about the definition that was provided by the state, which, by the way, I did run by the city attorney, who was also very confused by that definition. So I did not feel too bad. He made me so much better about myself. But if you recall the definition that was provided by the state, there was some discussion in that about the amount of time that someone would actually live in the house for it to be considered, or in the dwelling unit, I should say, for it to be considered owner occupied. And and I think their threshold in that definition was around 6 months. So I think that, there is an opportunity here for the city to maybe get at both and still allow for, a little bit of flexibility for those folks who are looking at this as kind of a supplemental income for their home that they've been living in for, 15 plus years or something. And now they're, going south in the during the winter or something like that. So you could kind of get at it both ways, maybe by placing some number of days on what an owner occupied unit means. The question, I think, is how is it verified? And that is something that the city attorney and myself and Jeremy talked about at length. And we would have to sort of sort out how that gets verified. I mean, it's ultimately up to the person who is permitted, the permittee, to show their work when they would come in for their annual business license renewal. And maybe there's some way to show it through the tax rolls. Maybe there's some way to show it through a third party like Airbnb or VRBO. I don't know that. I don't have that answer yet. But hopefully that helps a little bit, Commissioner Bennett, in what in the question you're asking. And there's no answer yet. I mean, I think it's up to us to kind of determine what that definition is, if we want to have any kind of flexibility built into it, or if it's just black and white.
Carl, I think we may be talking about measuring the wrong thing. I think what we're really interested in is how many days or months a year could the owner occupied dwelling be rented out as an unoccupied dwelling, right? And that typically has been maybe for 3 months of the year, the owner could fly off to Tahiti and rent the whole place out and still qualify as an owner occupied dwelling if he lived there the rest of the year. So, that's what I think we care about. How much of the time it's available as an unhosted rental.
And then in that scenario, Commissioner Brown, would they be able to rent out a portion of the house or rooms while they're actually living in the dwelling unit?
I would think so. Yeah, why not?
Okay.
Commissioner Grana?
Well, and kind of along the same lines that Tom just said, when I looked at the different things in the state of California, the one thing I noted was that lots of them cap the number of days a non-hosted rental can be done. which I thought, which kind of does what you were talking about. You know, it kind of comes at it from a different side. And so it allows it, but it still limits it, which is kind of feels better to me. I mean, obviously there's more conversation, but a number of the different cities that I read about, and I wrote this down, so I'm going to read it for a second. Non-hosted rentals capped at 90 days per year. And a number of them consistently did that. And I like the idea that it's still allowed for a non-hosted rental, but that it put a cap, it put a limit on it. And I'm not necessarily saying 90 days, but that was a number of cities did that. And I thought it was a good way to handle it. So there's my comment.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, I noticed that too, in the information that Commissioner Soltis shared with that rundown of the various California cities. And it's sort of like I had a bingo moment, which you seem to be alluding to, is like, oh, that sounds like a good answer. Again, is 90 days the right number? I don't know. But what it does is it discourages what everyone is kind of fearful of, not this summer or next summer, but over the course of the next 20 summers, of more and more investors just coming in and taking over homes that in Gig Harbor and just using them as short-term rentals, because they don't have a better place to put their money. And none of us want to see that happen to Gig Harbor. And there are plenty of examples, not just one. So it's not Chicken Little crying that the sky is falling where that has happened. I think you all had a chance to read the article that I sent out about Joshua Tree. And there's some pretty frightening stories in some pretty cool places where they have just been overtaken. And Joshua, there were some, I can't remember which one of you had sent out another article about another small town where this has been a real problem, where there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Airbnbs, and the town was just completely altered forever. So
And it can happen. It happens really fast.
yeah, right. Yeah, that's a good point. So Commissioner Krosick.
Yeah, Greg, I agree with your comment and with Commissioner Grina's. Also, getting back to the issue of enforcement, I think your neighbors are going to be the best tools that you have for enforcing. They're going to notice things going on. One other thing I noticed in that material that Commissioner Soltis sent out was that the city of Berkeley assesses a 2% enforcement fee. And I don't know if that was on the property owner or on the renter, but that might be a way to generate a few dollars to dedicate some staff time to enforcing this.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I suspect that, it'd just be a pass-through fee. But I don't think if we, and I don't know if I can't remember if this question is on the table or not, but we did have a discussion that as of having a requirement that every one of these can only rent through a third party like Airbnb or VRBO. And with that, I do believe that we can get reports from them because they will be sending the tax information and so on. And so it shouldn't be too hard to track. But what I don't know is, can you just flat out ask these platforms to say, these are our city, this is our city ordinance. We need to ensure that your Airbnb hosts are following our ordinance. And so we need to know the number of days that they're renting per year.
That question is on the table tonight as well, Chair. I don't.
As long since it popped up and I spoiled your fun, that's where it is on the hit parade. What do y'all think about that requirement of that all the rentals have to be done through a third party platform? It ensures the city gets the taxes. It makes the tracking much easier. It makes it cleaner so people can't cheat and hide under the rocks. and not go through the permitting process. And I don't see a downside to it.
Totally
I think-
agree.
I think we should specify that it must be an approved third-party platform, because there are alternate platforms that are springing up, as we saw in that Joshua Tree article. And so, Airbnb, et cetera, is fine, but we ought to reserve the right to approve the platform, I guess.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Approved, maybe by just by the director. I don't think we'd want to list out the platforms in the ordinance, but just kind of keep it generic, that sort of discretionary.
Yeah, you can maintain a list of approved platforms. Right now it's 2,
Well, it could be, as somebody pointed out, the number of companies that are participating in this field is growing. But we would also have to include potentially local real estate agents too. So the field of potential third parties is quite large.
Yeah, I think generally though, that the local real estate agents aren't interested in the short-term market. They're interested in the long-term market, but I may be wrong there.
Well, I'm sure they are as well, but they also maintain lists of renters.
Right.
We are in a very tight market now, so that has to be considered as a potential.
Yeah, good point. So then it sounds like we all kind of agree that this limitation of a number of days at a non-hosted, a non-owner occupied rental should be, is 90 the right number? Again, there's, I think, there were 3 or 4 of the counties, or excuse me, cities in California that seem to use that number. It was the only number that popped up when there was a number. So I don't know if what the magic is about that.
And just to interject briefly, I think, Jeremy, correct me, you've got a good memory for this, but I think that there is, at least in Washington State, I believe there was at least one jurisdiction that was at around 180 days or something like that, wasn't there? Am I wrong about that?
I think I just remember that from my own previous work history. It might have been Bellevue.
Okay.
Could have been a different one.
I think one I saw in the California listing was 120 days, and that seemed too much. I mean, I thought 90 was a good compromise.
Mm-hmm.
I like 90.
I see lots of nods. I don't see any head shaking.
90 is good.
So we're saying saying yes on owner occupied, meaning that someone cannot buy so what are we saying here? So because we're kind of talking about, it's almost 2 different things, owner occupied versus non-owner occupied, and then hosted versus unhosted in my mind. Because if you've got an owner occupied, an owner occupied unit to me means that the owner lives at that residence.
Yeah, it's their primary residence.
That's their primary residence. That's owner occupied. And then we're talking about the number of days that the house the unit could be rented out unhosted would be 90 days. But to the question I asked. No, that's not the way I understood our conversation just now. An owner occupied, that 90-day restriction doesn't apply to an owner occupied residence. It applies to a non-owner occupied building. So I wouldn't even call it a residence, a non-owner occupied house, dwelling unit. So someone just comes in and buys a property just with the specific intent of making it a short-term rental. They would be restricted to no more than 90 days a year renting that property out. That's what I thought we just discussed.
I don't, that's not what I thought we just discussed.
Okay,
I thought we had discussed no non-owner occupied short-term rental buildings in Gig Harbor. And for the owner occupied buildings, the owner could vacate the place for 90 days, up to 90 days, and rent it out on a non-host basis. That's where I thought we were.
That was my thought as well.
Me too.
Me too.
so, but, well, Bob, Commissioner Soltis had presented that he wasn't comfortable with just a blanket ban on all non-owner occupied. And somebody else had chimed in with, I think it was Commissioner Bennett, agreeing with that. So there's competing views.
Well, I respect that point of view, but what we're really talking about is saying we don't want this kind of business in Gig Harbor. And there's precedent for that.
Yeah, I think, even though it's not my opinion, but Tom's got it right. I mean, if the majority of the commission feels like they do not want non-owner occupied rentals, the kind of thing we fear that could happen, it's happened in other places, then the first order of businesses is to ban that particular kind. And what's left is the owner occupied, and that can be for up to 90 days. The whole building could be rented, or all year long, you could rent a room or two if your owner is still staying there. So there's actually two aspects of owner occupied. One is owner's there, one is the owner's not there.
Right. Okay, so then it seems we have 4 that are in favor of no non-owner occupied, 2 that have a different opinion about that. And I am on the fence on this issue and could be convinced either way. So it would seem then, although I was just going to say, Commissioner Bennett, you look like you want to say something.
Well, here, let me throw a wrench into it. I was just thinking of, I definitely understand this idea of not wanting just tons of people coming in and renting out houses. And I get that idea of not wanting that. What about limitations on something like that? Is there a happy medium in non-owner occupied and saying we can have X number in each area or something and capping it to allow for something like that? Do we want that? Does it matter? Is there an interest in having something like that just to be able to have it? Or is it really just let's not even go there and just leave it to owner occupied only?
I support owner occupied only primarily because fundamentally what we're talking about is if they're not owner occupied, if we're talking about people buying a house expressly to rent it out as a short-term rental, we are talking what is a defined business activity in a residential area. And I don't think we should support that.
Yeah, and I think if there's an exclamation to be put on the discussion, Larry, I think you just did it.
Keeping in mind, I'll playing devil's advocate to that point of view that might be brought up is that short-term rentals you could liken them in a lot of ways to a home occupation. They don't give any outward appearance of a business running within the unit. And I'm talking about just single-family residential unit. Somebody could open up a home occupation in your neighborhood and be running, say in some cases, I've seen hair salons open up as home occupations in a home. No signage. The only way you would know that somebody's running that business out of that home is that there's somebody showing up periodically, right? Scheduled, of course. But they are running a business there within the neighborhood. We don't permit those. That's just a business license. It's allowed. There are hundreds, if not thousands of them around, right? I mean, they're everywhere. And some of them are just somebody who has their home office, at their home. But there could be people who are preparing taxes for folks, who are running that home occupation out of their home. So I just want to throw that out there as a caveat, because these are short-term rentals are so weird. I've been kind of just banging my head over it for a long time now, trying to kind of sort it out. And it gets into it gets into a lot of things. There's a lot of tendrils that are attached to this subject. But I just want to be sure that commissioners are considering that fact that they don't necessarily operate differently than a long-term rental house or just a single-family residential home.
Commissioner Grina?
So I think another point we need to consider is, by not allowing somebody outside to buy one of these houses and use it entirely for that, we're allowing someone who wants to buy it, who might not be able to find a house. It's something that's available. I mean, it makes, what am I trying to say? It allows for more houses to be available for a person looking to buy them, as opposed to an outside investor just buying a house and using it that way. So I'm just bringing that up, that, I think that to me is better logic of why that is unappealing, is that, it's already hard to find a house. If houses are owned by somebody from out of state, then what have we done? So if we discourage that, anyway, that's my just additional point.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner Soltis?
I guess I'm kind of thinking about this in terms of what is best for the city of Gig Harbor. I'm on the fence too, Greg, but I think there's a lot of citizen comments about, well, it's really good for businesses, and a lot of businesses need the short-term rental people coming in and spending money for dinner and whatever they do down by the waterfront. But at the end of the day, I think we have to really think hard about the livability of our city and what's best for our residents. I don't really particularly care what's best for an investor in California or coming into the city. I mean, they're here to make money, and that's a noble pursuit, I suppose. But what do we care about the most? We want nice communities, nice neighborhoods, safe neighborhoods, and places where people can actually afford to live. So I'm kind of arguing myself onto the total ban of the short-term rentals for the non-owner occupied.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner Bennett?
Yeah, I'm very much in the same situation, but I have one more question then to bring up also, because back early on in the comments, when this first started, it may have been comments from the council's meeting, there was some talk, or someone had talked about converting a commercial space to an Airbnb. Commercial space is converted into short-term rentals because they're not owner occupied, would therefore then not be allowed. Is that what this would mean if we said no non-owner occupied?
A really good question, and I think we will address that at a later item that upcoming about what types of dwelling units constitute, fall under this ordinance. And right now we're in a permit process, a conditional use permit process with an applicant that has a commercial property, and they have an apartment within that commercial property. So it's essentially a mixed use building. And so it doesn't necessarily meet what we've been permitting these under. We've been permitting these under lodging level 1, the definition of lodging level 1. This one didn't meet that definition really. It's not really a bed and breakfast per se. It met the definition of a lodging level 3. So it was kind of something different. And we sort of put it there because just purely based on the definitions, motel, lodging level 2, hotel, where you have, you have to walk into the building to get to your room. It doesn't really meet that definition either. So yeah, I would say that if we were to go to something that was only owner, these are owner occupied only, then yeah, I think likely that would be true, that commercial properties would not fall under this ordinance. They would be something else.
Getting back to your comments, Carl, which have been marinating as the other folks have chimed in, but all those examples that you gave, someone that's a stylist who, starts, having their neighbor, and then they tell somebody, and it grows into a business. And so I appreciate those, but or it's an accountant, or it's someone who starts baking cakes, or the Gig Harbor lasagna lady. Right. Every one of those is still, in my mind, an owner-occupied business. It's still someone who lives there. They live in the neighborhood. They're invested in the neighborhood. They're part of the fabric of Gig Harbor. They're not selling out in any way. And so to me, that is just the same as an owner-occupied Airbnb. Because so I am, the more that we've talked about this, I think, as Bob fell off the fence, he dragged me to the owner-occupied only side as well. I just think, with the data that we have, from other places where this has gone wild, there was the data in that monster consultancy report that Commissioner Soltis had tracked down and that I had passed on to all the rest of you. That says, yeah, it does start to squeeze out people. It does have an upward pressure on prices. It does have a downward pressure on housing availability. And those were the concerns that we heard from a lot of the citizens. So
that's a great point, Chair. And I would say that as far as the home occupation thing goes, there is a distinction there, in that the home occupation, by definition, a home occupation, you have to live within that home. That has to be your primary residence, and it has to be the primary building. So in other words, you couldn't use an ADU for your home occupation. It has to be within the primary residence on the site, which brings up another question about accessory dwelling units, and owner occupied versus non-owner occupied. Are we considering an accessory dwelling unit an owner occupied unit? Keeping in mind that an accessory dwelling unit in our code, an accessory apartment is what we consider them. The owner of the site does have to live on the premises in order to rent that out.
I certainly think that that's an owner occupied situation. Yeah.
And that could be a basement unit or a separate actual physical building, as in a shed in the backyard type situation.
Yeah, attached or detached.
Okay.
600 square feet is our limitation in our
Okay.
code. And they have to be under the same ownership as the primary residential unit, with the owner living on site in either unit. So actually, the owner could live in the accessory apartment and rent out the primary residence too.
But in our situation, that would mean only for more 90 days.
Right.
To rent out that whole main unit. Okay.
I think so. I think that's where we're headed here. I think that's right, Commissioner Bennett.
I'm not quite sure of your question you're asking exactly, Carl. What are you asking us to weigh in on here?
I just wanted to bring up the fact that we do have to address accessory dwelling units as part of this ordinance, and whether or not we would allow an accessory apartment, is what we call them in our code, if we would allow them to be used as a short-term rental, if that would be considered an owner-occupied unit.
I agree with Tom. I think it should. I don't see why
Yeah.
it shouldn't.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. It's all part of the person's domicile.
I agree as well.
Same here.
Okay, and I think it works with our definition too of accessory apartment, so that all kind of fits together pretty nicely, actually. Okay, so I think, Chair, if I could be so bold, I think what I'm hearing then is, and let me share my screen, is that we are at, for number 4, we're at owner occupied only. And the minimum amount of time each year, well, that's not really the right question. And that's what Commissioner Brown was bringing up, is that this question doesn't really have, the question isn't about the minimum amount of time each year an owner must reside at the residence. The question really is the time the unit may be rented unhosted,
Right.
per year. And that's important because I think, so if I'm understanding everything correctly, then those 90 days are 90 days that someone could rent out their entire house or their entire accessory dwelling unit. Would only be for 90 days, but otherwise, if they're living here for the remainder of the year, for those other 9 months, they would be able to rent out a room or a couple rooms as an Airbnb. So the question then comes, I think, maybe the question is, would they be able to rent out an accessory apartment for those other 9 months or not?
If they're occupying the house, they can rent the accessory dwelling unit 12 months of the year,
Right.
I would think.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I'm feeling like 90 days isn't enough. So like, if you have a snowbird, who goes away for 4 months, or if they live up here and they're tired of what I'm looking out the window seeing, maybe even, they leave in November, don't come back until April. Why would we not allow them to do STRs for that whole period of time?
Would they still have the ability to have a long-term rental? What is the minimum to be a long-term rental?
31 days.
What was that?
31 days.
Okay. So they could get someone to come in, 3 chunks of people in during a 90-day time frame or something, versus lots of short-term rentals.
Well, in fact, they could do one single long-term rental. They could
Mhm.
they could do a 5-month sublet, or whatever.
Yeah. I feel like that'd probably be easier on a snowbird type person, but it might not be as lucrative either.
Right.
Well, and I would also add that the short-term rental market is not as hot at least in our area, in the wintertime.
And miss all this?
I think
I
we're,
think, Greg, if they wanted to rent it longer than 90 days, they would just go into that long-term rental agreement. And this 90 days is like bits and pieces hither and yon, weekends plus here and there. So that's probably a lot of rentals, a lot of short-term rentals within 90 day, that 90-day limit.
Mhm.
I just, the thing that gives me pause here just a little bit is the administration of this ordinance. If going this route, we don't want to create something that is so difficult and this kind of falls back on me to go do some research on this and figure out how to administer it. I understand that. I'm just kind of thinking out loud right now about how if it ends up too complex. I've seen codes where they have good intentions, and in the end their complexity sort of crushes itself in some ways. It's so hard to administer that it just loses its applicability. I don't know if that's where we are here or not, but it seems like I can see the verification process, the annual verification process to the business license being maybe difficult to prove, or sort of taking a lot of staff time to do the research and ferret out exactly how many days these things were rented for the year as a short-term rental versus the rest of the time when they were renting it as a long-term rental. Now, if we can get reports from, like we had said earlier, from Airbnb or VRBO or these companies, that solves that problem. I think if there's some way that we can get the lodging tax data breakdown through the county, that's another way that might, that we may be able to solve that problem. So I think there might be ways to do it. I'm just, I guess, just giving a little bit of pause and caution, just kind of throwing that out on the record so that, if and when we come back with an ordinance that differs slightly,
Right.
we'll already have kind of started that conversation a little bit.
Yeah.
This might sound a little negative, but I think in cases like this, you almost certainly have to fall back on management by exception. It would be almost impossible to enforce any of this without the participation of the people that live around a unit who might bring some deficiency to the attention of the appropriate authority. You think about driving down the freeway. Speed limit is 65. Don't see many cops. Most everybody's going faster than 65.
Yeah.
And if some guy's going 80, you've got to hope that somebody's going to pick up their cell phone and say, we've got a driver out here that's driving recklessly.
Right. Commissioner Krasik, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Bradbury. And also, Carl, I think that's the key to the enforcement issue is transferring as much of that burden as you can, the record keeping burden, onto the corporate Airbnbs and other organizations that are going to be handling these rentals.
Thank you. Commissioner Soltis?
What problem are we trying to solve with this 90-day thing? I think we're trying to ensure that this is a truly an owner-occupied building. I mean, that it's not some kind of shell that for an investor that's got sort of a fake owner occupied situation. Maybe if there's a way you can just determine this is indeed truly an owner occupied building, then you don't need to worry about how many days that they are gone or away, or if they meet that first criteria, then, and they can prove it and we can certify it, and maybe that's the end of the tracking of their information, other than what you can get to the Airbnb or the state or whatever. But maybe that's the kind of the key thing you want to get out of it, is it's truly an owner occupied, and then go at it, do the best thing you can do to make sure, as long as the guy is there or the gal is there. That's the key thing we want. It's just an observation, maybe.
And I think that's the way, Commissioner Soltis, that's the way I was approaching it with my questions in the table. And actually, they're not my questions. I mean, these are questions that we gleaned from stuff that you all had provided, really. But that was our line of thinking, and I see it from both sides. I see Commissioner Brown's side as well, and the way that he's approached it. I mean, they're both logical approaches to it, I think. And ultimately, I think they both get to the same end, probably. But I think the question is, what is most easily verifiable? And that's where the rubber kind of hits the road. And I'm not sure I have a good answer, or if anybody has a good answer to that yet.
Well, Carl, let's do this. Let's press on.
Yeah.
Then write the ordinance, and then, somewhere we'll step back and take a breath and say, you and Jeremy can make an assessment and say, this is one of two things. This is either unwieldy, or we have to hire one of these companies that you referenced at our last discussion to the enforcement, or we have to hire an additional staff member. And I think charging an enforcement tax is a reasonable idea. But the other piece of this, that to follow Larry's, excellent highway analogy, is you see all kinds of people speeding. In fact, the majority of people are speeding, but you hardly ever see HOV lane violators. And why is that? Because the speeding ticket ain't any big deal. You got to cough up $100, but the fine for an HOV violation is much more substantial. It's this, and that's why, and I don't know if we're going to get to it, but I am really in favor of severe penalties on the first violation, a more severe penalty on the second violation, and then revocation on the third. And I don't know what the right numbers are, but there's one little town in California where it's $1,500 for the first one, $5,000 for the second one. So that's going to make people think twice before they get in the HOV lane. So there will be self-policing if the penalties are severe enough, and there's really, in my mind, no reason not to make them severe.
Okay, Chair. So if I understand you correctly, then I think where we're at the moment then is sort of leaving it this way: owner occupied only, 90 days per year unhosted. And then I just made a note here: the ADU is considered owner occupied. Maybe that's in the wrong spot. Is that oversimplifying it, or does that kind of capture it? And of course, when we're writing up the ordinance, we'll come back and listen to this discussion and make sure we're capturing the full flavor.
Everybody ready to move on?
Okay. Number 6. So what is the limit for the number of short-term rentals an owner and/or entity may operate within Gig Harbor city limits at any one time? And so if short-term rentals are considered owner occupied only, that might just be a moot point. I think that maybe this one goes away, or do folks think that this is something we should still consider?
I think it just went away.
Okay. So number 7, the owner/manager must be available at all times to respond to complaints within how many hours? There was some discussion about 30 minutes. And we've seen in other codes, I mean, I think it's kind of all over the board, 12 to 14 hours. 24 hours, I think I saw in a code. And I suppose, so this would be during that time when, you know, during that 90 days, when somebody might be renting out the entire unit while they're snowbirding or something. And maybe they have a management company that's kind of managing the place for them, a local management company. Or maybe they're, you know, maybe it's an income generating activity for them, their business, and maybe they live someplace else. They've got a second home somewhere that they live at.
I'd
Mr.
like to
Crosby?
see rapid response, we'll say 2 hours, something like that.
Commissioner Krosik?
I'd go a little bit lower than that. I would say not more than an hour.
So for me, the question is, what are we talking about? You know, what's the question we're answering here, right, Bob? So does that mean a wild party in the backyard? Because if that's what it means, that the people that are to call the Gig Harbor Police, as you would for anything. If the issue is a water main break, you know, what's the question here when we're talking about response time? What are we responding to?
Well, I think I think it could be all of the above, Chair. I think that your first example is a good one, and probably one that, you know, everybody is kind of scared of that might happen. And I think that is a call to the police, but then who are the police to call? And I think they would be calling that management company, and or you know, they would show up at the residence. I think in this scenario, they would show up at the residence and they would say, you know, who's the owner? They would say, this is a short-term rental, we're renting out the house. And the police would say, I need to call the owner or manager. That would be posted on the good neighbor policy on the wall next to the telephone, although there's no telephone, so I don't know where you post it these days. And then they would be providing that number, so that they would call the owner. The owner would then respond within whatever that specified amount of time is. The nice thing about that scenario, that's probably an oversimplified scenario, and nothing's ever going to happen that cleanly. But the nice thing about that is then there is record of that. So that could be something that could be put into the record for that unit. And then when the business license comes up for renewal, they've got to check against them.
Right. Jeremy, you wanted to add something there?
Yeah, when Carl and I were looking at this, we kind of saw some examples in other codes, and one of them in particular is City of Olympia's, and they identify a distance that the local contact person should be available from. So theirs is 15 miles within the same county. Mm-hmm. So that could be something to consider as well.
Yeah.
Good point, Jeremy.
Yeah, well, I can give you an anecdote of one, and because you know, just down the street from us, there's a woman who does locum tenens work, and she rents out her waterfront, beautiful house. STRs, don't know whether she's registered or not. And our friend, you know, got a phone call from her when she was down in Oregon working, and saying, you know, there's a drunk guy who lost his key, banging on the door and raising a ruckus. Would you mind going over and dealing with it? So. Right. So, you know, I can't, I'm trying to imagine a scenario where 12 hours is reasonable. So I'm inclined to be on the very, very short tethered timeline, especially if it's a disturbance or, you know, whatever the emergency might be. Because something inside the home that is a problem for the guest because a refrigerator broke isn't really our problem or a problem of the ordinance. So, you know, if it's these neighborhood disturbance issues that we're talking about, the shorter the better. within reason.
Hey, Greg, maybe like public safety or public nuisances requires that, immediate response. And like you said, the refrigerator doesn't work. Well, that's between them and the owner, and that's not necessarily anything we need to care about. But we got to focus on things that are in the public domain, and that should be probably fairly quick, at least for to be able to contact somebody. I mean, maybe they can't take action, but they can at least have to have somebody on speed dial for a couple hours whenever it's being rented.
Yeah, I mean, even if your management company is in Tacoma, they can be here in an hour.
Oh, yeah. So am I hearing an hour then? Is that kind of where we're, or not more than an hour, some language like that?
Sounds good.
One hour is fine with me.
Okay,
Zoom webinar.
for non-owner occupied STRs, there will be a requirement for how close an owner manager must live in relation to the STR. This one goes away as well.
Yep.
So knocking them out. Okay. What type of dwelling units are allowed to house a short-term rental? And if we do have different types of short-term rentals allowances, would we have different levels of permitting for them? In other words, would maybe something like something in a commercial district, like we were talking about earlier that Commissioner Bennett had brought up, would that be considered a conditional use permit rather than the type 2 permit? Are we going to look at liveaboards and address that as part of this ordinance, or are we going to leave that alone? Those are kind of the questions here. Typically, we're talking about single family residential dwelling units, and that's mostly what we have in the city, of course. And so that's likely what is going to be brought up most of the time. But of course, we do have duplexes. We have some triplexes. We have some multiple family apartments. Do we want to capture those under this ordinance, or do we care as much to capture them with this ordinance?
Commissioner Krosick.
Yeah, I would suggest that we limit short-term rentals to single-family homes, because I think there's too many potential problems that will occur when you have short-term rentals in dwelling units that share a wall. I think we can also include liveaboards with that. That we can include liveaboards in the ordinance, but I would not be in favor in having it in duplexes, triplexes, apartments, etc.
I feel like liveaboards aren't too far off from a multiplex also, just given the proximity of units next to each other, and even though they're not sharing walls necessarily, they definitely don't have the same thickness of walls as single family residences do.
I think liveaboards are too complex an issue to be treated adequately by this ordinance. And there are already multiple regulations, the marina owners and the state about liveaboards. I think it's a can of worms that I don't think we should open it.
I would agree with that. When you're talking about liveaboards, it's either going to be in a marina that's controlled by the rules and regulations of that marina, or it's going to be a boat off of somebody's private pier, which then begins to look like an ADU.
And which is not allowed by state regulation. The only place you can live aboard on a boat is in a privately owned marina. or
Commercial
some kind-
marina.
Commercial marina, yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. So, I can, it would be easy for me to, imagine a scenario where there's a triplex, and I don't know where they, where in Gig Harbor is there a triplex, for example?
The only one I can think of off the top of my head is the one that's down on, there's one down on Harbor View. It was kind of questionable whether or not we were calling it a triplex or not. It's sort of a duplex and then another unit. And then there's a carport that connects those.
Oh,
two-
you're talking
those
right here
two
at the head of
structures.
the harbor.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, that's right near the property I was just referencing earlier.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Not the same property, but virtually next door. So I could see someone either, early in life, well, I guess at any stage of life, that they would own a triplex, live in one of them, and then use the other two as short-term rentals. And so I don't know how does the city declare something a duplex or a triplex? Is it so that, so in other words, if someone bought that whole building and so that's they now declare that this is my single family home, but the walls were already there, and I'm going to rent them out as short-term rentals on either side. I don't.
Each one of those, Chair, are individual dwelling units.
Right. So why would it be bad to allow the scenario I just described to happen?
It would be limited to 90 days, and it probably wouldn't be a financial in their interest to only be able to rent them for 90 days each, or only one of them. I'm not sure how that would work.
No.
Although if they're living there, maybe not. Okay.
Yeah, they're living in the middle and they could do it year round.
Yeah.
Commissioner Grana?
I was just going to say there are good examples of that on Grandview, where it's a one-story building, and there are like 4 different units in the building. And I kind of agree, you own one of them and maybe you rent out one of them or 2 of them. I mean, my bringing it up is just because it's a visual, you can kind of get an idea what that looks like if you know what where I'm talking about. And I don't know why we would limit it under that set of circumstance. I don't know. I'm still thinking on this, but I just wanted to bring that example up.
Yeah, thanks. Commissioner Krosik?
Yeah, I live in a duplex, and there are issues that come up when you share a wall with neighbors. And so I do not think I would really be comfortable with my neighbor renting out part of his part of our shared wall unit as a short-term rental. I think there are all kinds of issues that can come up. Plus, you've also got problems when it comes to backyards, front yards, parking, those kind of things all occur. The other thing, when you're talking about, like, let's say a fourplex, let's say somebody buys 3 of the units and decides to rent out 2 of them, and I live in the 4th unit. That's going to create a whole host of problems for me as well if I was that person. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, is from my own personal experience of living in a duplex and understanding that there are certain unique issues that occur as a result of sharing a wall with a neighbor.
I think that's a great point, Commissioner Krosik, because I think the way we were looking at this is you would have one owner who owns the whole building. So even if it's a fourplex, or in your case, in a duplex, the owner would own both of those dwelling units. They would have to own both dwelling units. And then they would rent out the other dwelling unit on a short-term basis if they wanted to, or they could rent it out on a long-term basis. They would rent it out in some manner, right? Because they're not living in it, so they're gonna want to rent it out in some manner. Otherwise, it certainly doesn't make financial sense to own the whole building. But if they wanted to do it on a short-term basis, then they would have to live in at least one of those units. Again, I think it kind of comes back to a verification conundrum in the long run, but they wouldn't, I think it gets problematic when we're talking about dwelling units, though, because if we're saying that owner occupied means that person, that is their primary dwelling unit, that's where they reside at least 9 months out of the year. That's one dwelling unit. It's not a building. A duplex is considered 2 dwelling units. So they're not really residing in both of those dwelling units 9 months out of the year. They're only residing in one of them, or in Commissioner Greina's example, a fourplex, right? They're certainly not residing in all 4 of those units. They're just residing in one of those. So that one would be the one that they would maybe have licensed to be able to rent out for 9 months out of the year on a short-term rental basis. But of course, that would be up to the management company at that point, or the ownership of the building. So it's not really apples and apples.
Yeah, understood. Commissioner Soltis?
I think we're kind of coming to this conundrum. This is too complicated. And maybe the safest route here is to simply ban short-term rentals in any non-single family residential unit. There are so many ins and outs here that I don't think we could write this ordinance without spending a couple of years to figure out all the ins and outs.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I think that, Carl's point that they're each considered dwelling units. So I'm sure there's some process you could go through with the city to, cut holes in the walls and make doors, and then go back and say, I declare this one dwelling unit instead of 3. But short of doing that, I'm feeling the same way that and I don't want to say easy, because obviously we're willing to do hard work. But with the complexity of it, I tend to agree with you, Bob, that and the other points people have made, that that any multi being 2 or greater is not allowed. Commissioner Krasik, do you want to add something?
Sorry, I still had my hand up. No, I agree with the idea of total bans, as I've said.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I think everybody's nodding.
Okay.
Zoom webinar.
So I've got single family residential only, and then of course accessory apartments. We already talked about that. So number 10, should the regulations impose limitations on the number of short-term rentals in the city? So this gets into that discussion about proximity. And so there was some discussion last time around about limiting the number of these throughout the city by proximity. 300, 500, and 1,000 feet was brought up. And again, I can go back if the Planning Commission still wants to discuss that and is interested in imposing that as part of these regulations. I've got some examples of what 300, 500, and 1,000 feet looks like, similar to what we were looking at earlier. I will say that I had a discussion with the city attorney about this, and he had questions about what the reason was for imposing a proximity limitation, or a limitation at all. And so he said we would want to definitely have good evidence and a good narrative as to why that was something that was needed and necessary, and it wasn't just a NIMBY issue. And I did discuss with him a lot of the things that were brought up here by Planning Commission, and a lot of the things that were also brought up by comments that we heard from folks in the community. And I think there is a lot of research out there that we've seen that Planning Commission has brought together, and other jurisdictions that we've seen that have done some form of limitation. I don't know if it's exactly this or not, but anyway, that I think I've set it up enough for the discussion here.
Thanks. Commissioner Grana.
So it looked like reading those California examples that when either they said that there was a limit of like 60 short-term rentals in a city limit, or they used the distance. I mean, the point was to control how many there are. My point about using the distance is so that one particular area of the city doesn't have a ton of them, which seems unfair to the residents in that area. So part of my reason why we needed distance was to keep them from being clustered together, super concentrated in an area that's actually like easy to walk to downtown or something like that. So there you go.
Okay, thanks. Excellent point. Commissioner Krosick.
Yeah, I think the justification for having some sort of limitation, whether it's a distance limitation or a total number of short-term rentals for the entire city, is traffic. You start allowing, when you have a short-term rental, let's say we have, we figure that the average household generates 5 trips a day. So now you've got short-term rentals, you're generating 10 trips a day. So it's kind of a multiplication effect. And there's already way too much traffic in this city for our transportation system to handle. And so I think that's our justification for placing some limitations on this.
Okay. Commissioner Soltis.
But didn't we, by banning non-owner occupied, didn't we just cut the numbers down dramatically for what is in the city and what is likely to be in the city? If it's owner occupied, it's going to be kind of a niche rental. And I don't know what the distribution is today of those two different kinds of short-term rentals, but I would suspect that, we've cut it down by 2/3 at least. Carl, you think maybe?
That was the point I was going to make to Commissioner Soltis, is I think that, while I think that there might be some merit to a proximity regulation, and I can think of a few areas in town where it is maybe would be very beneficial. I also agree with you that I think by doing, if we go down that road of only allowing 90 days for non-owner or for unhosted short-term rentals, you have cut down the density on them quite a bit. There's gonna be a lot less people, I think, who'd be willing to set up a short-term rental when it's owner occupied. That said, unless they've got an accessory apartment, which there aren't that many of in the city at this point.
So, Commissioner Krosick.
Yeah. Do any of our planning commission members live in Harbor Hill? Just out of curiosity. Okay, Amanda does. I was going through there the other day on a bike ride and looking at the close proximity of the houses and how relatively little parking, on-street parking there is. And I'm wondering, so suppose that you had a bunch of short-term rentals And before people say that nobody would want to have a short-term rental in Harbor Hill, one of the reasons that people have short-term rentals is that they come here to work. They may be working as a traveling nurse or a traveling ER doc or some other occupation. And so Harbor Hill would be perfect for that sort of thing. It's close to the hospital and other places. So that's why I think it probably makes sense to have a proximity limitation, because there are some areas of the city where we would not want to have short-term rentals in concentrations or very dense configurations.
I'm pretty sure our HOA up in Harbor Hill here would not allow short-term rentals. So we're bound by that. There's lots of long-term rentals in here, but short-term rentals are not allowed. And that's for probably all of Harbor Hill, as far as I know, because our HOA is pretty extensive here.
Mhm. Yeah, and I would say to Commissioner Bennett's point there that I think there's a lot of subdivisions or that are organized and have CC&Rs that are still recognized and valid, that are not allowing this type of, and some don't even allow long-term rentals, but definitely short-term rentals for a lot of the reasons that we've brought up here or that we've heard. I wanted to make one point too on what Commissioner Krosick said about traffic, if I could. This is a conversation that I've been having with folks internal here with Public Works about use and change of use and short-term rentals and what constitutes a change of use and what we need for a complete and approvable application for a change in use. And so for instance, if we have a commercial building that is changing from a doctor's office to a restaurant, that's considered a change of use, and they would have to look at concurrency very closely. We would have a site plan amendment associated with that, and the applicant would have to submit CRC applications, and Public Works would look at what that change in use constitutes relative to traffic counts, to water and wastewater. And the new owner then would have to pay those pay fees for each of the additional ERUs that they would be generating. So additional trips, for instance. And in talking with Public Works about this, I'm kind of making the case a little bit that we're not really, is this really a change in use when we're talking about a single family home and a short-term rental? The home, again, kind of back to my argument about home occupation versus short-term rental and how closely aligned those are. I think this is another case where it's fairly closely aligned. The short-term rental, I don't think changes that too much, really. The house still operates, the single family dwelling unit still operates like a single family dwelling unit, although they may have maybe a few more people staying there than they might otherwise. There might be an extra car there because maybe there's two families. But generally speaking, it's not operating too much different, very, very differently.
Oh, that was my view as well.
Yeah, thanks for that information. Yeah, I think that from my perspective, what we got to think about, do our best, make our best effort at looking, again, not just right now and 2 years from now, but 10 years and 20 years from now, because the ordinance is going to be written and any change to it will be very difficult, especially to make it more restrictive. A lot easier to make it less restrictive. And so, nobody can read the future, but so the housing bubble bursts and real estate prices crash. And, prime opportunity for investors to come swooping in and make business sense out of things that didn't necessarily make business sense before, with respect to grabbing up historic homes in Gig Harbor and converting them to, to STRs. So, would that happen? I don't know. Has it happened other places? You betcha. So I'm leery about just having this. It's got to be owner occupied as the only thing that is going to limit the density pressure, because I can envision scenarios where that even with owner occupied, that more and more homes could convert to owner occupied STRs, because people like coming to Gig Harbor. Short of the pandemic, people continue to come to Gig Harbor, and I think they will in the future because it's such a cool place. So, and if we don't protect what Gig Harbor is about, then that's what's gonna negatively impact ultimately tourism, because well, for obvious reasons, I don't need to explain that. I just don't feel completely comfortable of not having some limitation of density, whether it's spacing or absolute number of permits, especially when you're talking about the downtown core, because that, let's face it, that's where people are going to want to come. If the STRs are available in the downtown core, they are gonna be sold, because then people could just walk the harbor, and that's what they come to Gig Harbor to do.
Well, if I may make a comment about the proximity, that's subject to abuse. For example, if I could take out a permit on my residence and block everybody else within 500 feet, right?
Right.
Whether or not I intended to use my place as an STR. And I'm just afraid that there are unforeseen difficulties with that proximity approach, that being one of them.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tom.
A very good point. I hadn't considered that.
Somewhere along the line I was reading, and maybe it was in the consultancy report though, that that was addressed, that if your STR permit lays fallow, then it will be revoked. And maybe that's I hadn't really thought of it, but maybe that's the intent, is to prevent that from happening. So if you have a permit and you never use it, it'll be revoked and given to somebody else.
More complications.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I would be in favor of limiting the total number of STRs to some percentage of the single family dwelling units, or some absolute number. I think that makes good sense.
Would that be done by district or by the total population of homes in Gig Harbor?
I do it by district because I really want to protect the historic district.
And when you say district, you mean zone? We're saying zoning district?
Whatever constitutes the historic district,
And that's made up of a bunch of different zones. So yeah, I mean, we would be looking at, although there is an overlay, I mean, we do have the historic district defined. So that is something that we can do if we're just looking at the historic district and then everything not in the historic district. I guess that's one way to look at it.
Commissioner Krozik?
How about doing both? Is that maybe we have a limitation in the historic district, and then and it really doesn't matter to me whether we do it by proximity or by total number of units, but that we have one set of criteria for the historic district, and then maybe a total limitation of housing in the rest of the city.
I'd be fine with that.
keeping in mind that likely the case is that most of the short-term rentals that we either have currently in the city or that would want to come into the city are going to be in the historic district. Stating the obvious, but that's what I'm here to do.
I think the idea of a percentage in the historic district is a good idea, and I don't know what the right number is, but, because I don't know what the number is today. But something very small, but historic district is the area that I think is the area that's most at risk.
I think, you know, when notwithstanding what the city calls the historic district, that because, for example, I think the official historic district ends, before my home, for example, but my home was built in 1910, and so it seems odd to me that I might be out of that actual range, and so, and mine isn't the only structure. There's, built, residences right across the street that sit on the water with it have, it's the same. So I'm curious what people envision when they say the historic district. What is it you all are thinking about when you say that? Or maybe asked differently, what are the areas you're interested in protecting?
And I can bring up the historic district in our GIS and show it to you if you'd like to see it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Bear with me just a moment here while I find it in our layers.
Sure. Does anybody want to comment in the meantime?
I think definitely Carl should add to the draft regulation that some kind of language that if the permit is not used, like you mentioned, Greg, if it goes fallow, then it's revoked. So something like that would probably be a pretty good addition to the verbiage. It made sense to me.
It's going to be just a minute. I'm going to have to refresh my system. It's clunky.
Okay.
One moment.
Well, Carl, does the historic district cover, or from what Greg is saying, the historic district does not cover the entire waterfront?
It does cover the entire waterfront.
Okay.
My bad. Sorry.
Oops. Okay, here we go. But it doesn't cover as much of the upland in Finholm, as you'll see here in just a second.
Well, Carl,
Zoom webinar.
Carl, let me just ask you this. You could expand the historic district and call it something else easily enough, right? I mean, you could draw the line wherever you want for the purpose of this ordinance. Am I right?
Well, that is one thing that we could do. I mean, we could draw up our own sort of zones or overlay. That's what we did for the sign code, for instance.
Yeah.
When we were talking about temporary signs in the right of way, we sort of drew up our own map for that. We also have zones within our sign code. I think we've got 2 zones in there overall throughout the city, and different regulations that apply to each. But I think we want to be careful about the danger. The danger with that is that you're putting some people in and taking some people out, and you need to have good reason for doing that. Right now, we've got a historic district that really nobody can argue with, because it's been codified for years. And so, if we're going to go about drawing boundaries for who's in and who's out, that sometimes can get a little get a little dicey because that's, and especially when we're talking about this particular ordinance, because we are talking about land use and people's rights and how they can use their land and how they could benefit from the use of their land. Does anybody want me to zoom in any further here, or does this show it pretty well?
No, I think it shows it pretty well, Carl, and I think it does cover most of the area that I was concerned with. You know, what you said that it doesn't really cover as much in the Finholm area, that's a bit of a concern, but I certainly agree with what you're saying, that we've got precedent and all kinds of reasons as to why we can say that we want to limit in this area and not get a lot of other arguments there.
Carl, would it include the view homes that are above Finholm that overlook the harbor?
Not all the way up the hill. So you can see here that it's really just along North Harbor View. It doesn't get up along Franklin or up to Prentice or any of these areas up here.
Okay, I gotta say this, Carl. It doesn't include my home. It stops right, right below my house.
All right, you were right.
I was pretty sure that was a correct statement.
You were thinking about those windows you replaced the other day.
Well, I like the idea of consistency with the existing historical district, but I think that there's probably some pretty high value targets in that Finholm area for a short-term rental that might be, excluded. If you excluded that part, they could probably be some fairly good targets.
Yeah, and well, we eliminated duplexes because there is a duplex up there on Franklin. But that's a duplex, so that one's been excluded already. Most of those homes have been redeveloped and remodeled.
What if we say a percentage in the historic and Finholm area? Could we do that? I mean, call out those two things. I know, there's overlap, but does that make any sense?
I guess we'd have to define Finholm, in that way. I mean, Finholm really is, it was declared a historic district long ago. And it was really just this area down here along North Harbor View. There's an ordinance or it's a resolution, I can't remember which, that declared this area historic. And there was supposed to have been some consistent signage and consistent architecture that would have gone along with that. And that might have predated what we consider the historic district today, or it might be vice versa. I can't remember now. But we don't have any regulations specific to that.
Well, I was uncertain as we began this discussion, but as I listened to the discussion, I think I'm being won over to the side of establishing a distance of 500 feet. Within that circle, only one can exist. That way you would wind up at Finholm, for example, with perhaps just one or a maximum of two possibilities.
So this is what 300 feet looks like in the middle of Millville. This is what 500 feet looks like from that same point. This is what 1,000 feet looks like from that same point.
Yeah, you're basically wiping out short-term rentals. at that, 1,500 is about the same. I mean, that's a lot of houses you take out of the game by just having one STR.
Yeah,
I personally don't have a problem with that. The idea that we've been talking about is some form of restriction, not just in proximity, but in total numbers.
If you're gonna restrict it
many-
that much, you might as well eliminate all STRs.
Carl, how many applications are pending right now?
Michelle, is it, or maybe Jeremy? I think Jeremy,
4.
4, okay.
I have 3.
3.
Okay, well, I'm just concerned that if we had a 500 or 1,000-foot proximity limitation, you might have a conflict between two applications that were within that circle. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, those applications would still be valid, they would be vested. And we would continue to process those, and then they would end up being at least I think, this is what I'm saying off the top of my head, they would be vested, and then we would be having a non-conforming situation, essentially, is what we would end up with.
With 3 or 4 pending applications, it doesn't sound like a big problem.
But considering that we do have a lot that are already permitted within the city, well, not a lot, but I think the number is somewhere between 7 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, about 9 or 10 that we know of throughout the city. So that are actually permitted.
so is this, did you choose 3505? Is this the one that is already permitted and is functioning as a B&B, I mean, a Airbnb?
Yes.
And then if I blow this up, I know that there is another historic house that's right on Harbor View that is also functioning as an Airbnb, although I don't know whether or not they've been through the permitting process. But is that, you know which house I'm talking about? That's 3518 Harbor View.
Oh, 3518. No, I don't know. This is one I know on Harbor View.
Yeah, it's the White House with the really nice gardens.
Oh, right down across from Millville Pizza. That area?
Novak and Harborview.
Yeah, if you go back to the other map, I think it is just outside the circle on Harborview there on the corner of Novak and Harborview.
That's 3518.
Yeah.
I don't have that address on my list of ones that we've approved.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm just trying to
Yeah.
So about how many single-family residences are there in the historic district? Just ballpark.
Within the historic district. Boy. I couldn't even hazard a guess. I don't know.
Okay, well, different question. If we had a 500-foot proximity circle, how many permits would we be able to issue within the historic district? About,
If we had a 500 foot,
yeah.
well, let's just look at it from this perspective. So 500 feet in the middle of Millville pretty much takes out Millville.
Okay,
So let's go back to our map. So if we've eliminated Millville, here, so then you've got, you know, maybe there's one more here. You might get two here in the DB.
so a handful.
Going down this way, you're gonna get, you know, maybe 10.
10? Oh, well, that seems to me to be not an unreasonable number of STRs in the historic district. What do other people feel?
I'm looking at Airbnb right now and I'm seeing 7 in the Millville district. And I'm seeing 10 over in Finholm between Prentice and the waterfront.
So here's Prentice. Let's go back really quick here and just look at what I'm okay.
Greg, if I may?
Yeah.
I'm starting to feel like the right thing to do here is to do a maximum number for the historic district. And we can kind of set that based on what we kind of know is happening today, but make it, you know, that what's happening today plus X, and that's the limit.
It wouldn't be impossible for us to figure out how many single family dwelling units there are in the historic district. Mike Simmons, our GIS technician, could easily pull that number for us very quickly. He could do that query. It wouldn't take much for him to do. So that's not something we can't get. It's just something I don't want to take a guess at here because I don't think I'd get it right. Jeremy, you would like you.
I have the number of parcels in the historic district, but not the number of single family residences.
What's that?
1,001.
Okay, but keeping in mind that there are several condos and there are several marinas where we have that have been condominiumized essentially by so you have to filter those out in some way. We've also got some multifamily that has been condominiumized down there too. So, but let's say, so say 1,000, say take out, I don't know, again, we'd just be guessing if we said anything.
Carl, could you pull up that map again of your 300, 500 and?
Of course.
Zoom webinar.
Yeah, so if you can blow that up. And if you go, so if you look halfway between Dorotich and Novak on Harborview Drive, right in there, right there, that property is also an Airbnb. So I don't know if it's permitted or not. It's one to the left of where you have your little hand right there. So, and so again, I'm just giving that as a reference point for folks as we contemplate this. And I believe that the one that you have in the orange square is a non-owner occupied, and the one down on Harborview is owner occupied.
I'm beginning to think that it might already be too late for either one of these kinds of restrictions without grandfathering a whole lot of people.
Well, we talked about that at the last meeting, and there is a way to address that, and we would not have to be bound, and other jurisdictions have done this, that you don't have to be bound in perpetuity, especially if someone hasn't been through the proper permitting channels, previously.
Yeah, that's correct, Chair. And I think that's a really good point. But yeah, they're not grandfathered. They would be considered non-conforming. So legally established if they had been permitted, legally established non-conforming. If they're operating and they haven't gotten a permit, then they're not legally established. They're not non-conforming. They're not grandfathered. They're an illegal use at that point.
So I think that I'd be more inclined to be going with the thought of a number as opposed to a distance restriction, although it feels distasteful that you could stack 3 of these up right in a row in a neighborhood. That just doesn't feel right. But when you start drawing that circle, it goes, somehow I envision this more along the lines of 300 feet along the street as opposed to 300 feet, on the next street over.
Another way to think about it may be on a block by block basis, but again, then it kind of comes down to management, administering that law. It's more difficult, but it's not impossible either. And of course, you'd have to define that, define a block, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I'm not suggesting that's what we should do. It's just I don't know. Those circles just look awfully big when you look at that map, even at 300 feet.
Yeah. Well, and that is 300 feet. I mean, it's, that's sort of an arbitrary number in a lot of ways. We chose 300, 500, and 1,000 because that's what Planning Commission, what you guys talked about last time we met. I mean, it could certainly be less than that. Doesn't have to be 300. It could be a 150. You could pick a circle half of that if we chose to. Or we could say adjacent.
Commissioner Krosick.
Yeah, Carl, that's a really good idea, is that we say that they can't be adjacent to another short-term rental. And then maybe on top of that, we say that there can't be more than 20 or 25 in total in the historic district. That might be a way of addressing it without getting into this problem of these great big circles.
Adjacent meaning next door.
Well, we could define that. I mean, I think to the chair's point about it being distasteful to have these stacked up on top of each other, and also keeping in mind that we're going to have come up with good justification for why this is necessary, why and needs to be defensible. But it could be where property boundaries touch, and maybe across the street, something along those lines. I don't know. We'd have to play around with that language a little bit, but adjacent, typically when we say adjacent in land use, we're usually talking about where it's touching, although and sometimes in the design manual, we have some cases where it includes those properties directly across the street, or in kitty corner, or not kitty corner. I don't think that ever shows up, but across the street.
So so John has thrown out a number of 20 or 25. I think we need to be thoughtful about that, and thoughtful about whatever number we come up with, and not just pick a number randomly. I think we need to have some reason and logic behind whatever number we come up with.
So I looked back. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Shannon, that's fine.
Because originally I had pulled some stuff from, I think it was Sonoma County in California, because they have an area that people really like to be in, and they call it the over concentration requirement, which I like. I like that wording, over concentration. And as much as I like a number thing, it seems easier to do a distance thing. To me, that seems like a better way to more fairly avoid over-concentration. So there you go. I just like the term over-concentration requirement. I think that's a good way to justify why we're even having this conversation.
Right.
A discrete number is probably not very supportable from the concept of the number of housing units within the city limits changing over time. From
Well,
that
I think
point of view, a percentage would work better.
Yeah, that's a good point, Larry. But I was thinking, I guess specifically right now in the historic district, about and in general, I don't think if that changes much, it's not going to change much at all, because there aren't many pieces of vacant property left. And so you said it's 1,001 plats of land, Jeremy, in the historic district?
1,001 parcels, which includes condominiums,
Okay.
marina slips, things like that. So the number of single family homes would be a lot lower than that.
Yeah. Okay. Commissioner Krozak, you have your hand up?
Yeah, Greg, the reason I came up with 20 or 25 was I think maybe it was Amanda who said that, or maybe it was Shannon, who said that they looked on Airbnb and determined that there was like 17 Airbnb properties in that district right now. And so the reason I picked 20 or 25 was to give a little bit of room for growth. And also I wanted to ask Shannon, would you feel comfortable in saying that there can't be properties, short-term rentals in properties adjacent to each other? Would that help avoid the issue of over-concentration?
I like that. I think that feels a whole lot better to me. So.
Well, if there's a bunch of hands up, but could I just play devil's advocate, and what happens if you're the guy sandwiched between two of them?
Yeah, well, point taken.
Amanda, you had your hand up next.
One of the things I'm curious about too, when we're talking quantity, is it quantity of parcels being used? In looking at Airbnb, I'm seeing some parcels where they have multiple rentals on them. that they have 2, 3 rooms, 4 rooms available, the waterfront inn, the parsonage. What used to be, as far as I knew, were Airbnb or were bed and breakfasts, but now are using short-term rentals on there. Is that, if we have a cap of 25 within a historic district, does that mean 25 rentals or 25 parcels with however many rentals are available within that space? If they've got 3 rooms that they're renting out.
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that the parsonage is still functioning as an Airbnb. But what's blurring the lines even more, and I just read another article yesterday, I think it was in the New York Times, that because the traditional bed and breakfasts that are still functioning as bed and breakfast, where you really do get a breakfast, are using the cheap and free advertising, as it were, of these big platforms, and it's helping their business. And the waterfront inn, I don't think has ever. Well, I don't know. I don't think they function as a bed and breakfast, but I don't know that for sure. Do you happen to know, Carl or Michelle?
I think they are are they lodging level 1, Michelle? They have a lodging level 1.
They are lodging level 1.
Yeah. So, which is,
And they have somebody living, they say they have somebody living in there full time.
which is technically lodging level 1 was our bed and breakfast before we came up with the lodging level 1, 2, 3. So, but again, we don't have, and there's a fine line, and we've talked about this last time, between bed and breakfast and short-term rental. And oddly, we did some research on this to try and kind of ferret out at the state level how a short-term rental is defined. Well, we found that, of course, but how a bed and breakfast is defined versus that short-term rental. The only definitions that we could find around bed and breakfast at the state are from the Liquor and Cannabis Board, which is just, we were kind of blown away, and the city attorney couldn't find anything else either. So they actually, if you are a bed and breakfast, then you have to get a permit from the Liquor and Cannabis Control Board in order to be a bed and breakfast, as that's the best we could tell. Jeremy, am I characterizing that properly? I think I've got that right.
Yeah, that's pretty much what we found from the state level.
Yeah, and the history of the waterfront inn is it used to be a small historic home. It was purchased and then expanded, got a bunch of variances to make it as big as it is, height variance, side variance. Full disclosure, I fought it during the entire permitting process, and so it is now, I think they actually have 7 rooms in there, Amanda, to answer your question. And it did change the character of the neighborhood, and it changes the character of what I see when I look out my front window. But that's the way it is. Somebody bought the land and they went through the process, and they were able to do that. So, and then the owners moved out of state. They became a pure investor. They didn't live there. And then just recently it finally sold, and they have a full-time manager living on site. So, that's the history. So yeah, what we're exactly talking about, what everybody's concerned about, I've watched happen live out my front window, in the early 2000s.
Hey, Greg, I think maybe another option that we probably ought to do a little bit more thinking about is a 200-foot limit, something smaller than the 300. The 300-foot, that looked like there are like 50 houses and one would be a short-term rental on that 50. I mean, I just counted them quickly, but that's a pretty small percentage of short-term rentals to houses. Maybe a 200-foot circle would be more reasonable. And then it gets to your concentration point that Shannon brings up. That's truly that tells you the concentration for a given area. And
Right.
you can maybe stand behind that a little bit better. But 300 feet, 500 feet, I think that's not reasonable.
Yeah. I would agree. And, with the skinny lots in the historic area, 50 feet, yeah, 200, then, it'd kind of be every fourth house at a max, which I guess, feels better. And, but I think the suggestion of having a combination of a distance limitation and a total number also seems reasonable to me.
I agree with that.
So we've got the adjacent, we've got the cone of shame, and we've got a total number. Now, how's Carl going to work with that?
Well, can you whip up that map once again, Carl? Because I think we can all envision, a diameter that's 2/3 of what you're showing at 300 feet.
I've got a 200 feet up right now, so let me show that to you.
You're amazing. Again.
It's all Michelle. She teaches me how to do all this stuff.
Zoom webinar.
So there you go. That's 200 feet from just I just picked a random point on a house on Ross, just because that's kind of where we were looking previously. I can turn the historic district layer off if you like, if that is.
Yeah, that'd be good for me anyway. Thanks.
And so, oh no. There we go. Oh. Well, that's picking up now all the houses that are within that circle touches. I don't know why it changed to that on me. This is why Michelle should be doing this, not me.
Mike's the real genius. He can figure that out quick. We'll have him on the next meeting.
Yeah, but that is what that's showing. So you can see all those parcels that are highlighted or touched by that 200-foot circle from that middle point here at this address. And if we change that to that's 150.
Okay.
That kind of gets to something like a city block at about 150 feet.
Okay.
If we're gonna,
If there-
I was gonna say, if
if
we're
there-
gonna go with a measurement, would it be from the parcel boundary? We would have to define where the 150 or the 200 feet would come from.
Yeah, and that there again, that's something that I don't know how to do that. Let's see here. Oh, maybe if I do it this way, hang on.
In California, that's how they do it, Amanda. They do it by the parcel corners or
Okay.
edges. Parcel boundary, yes.
That makes sense. Just in case you ever get a neighbor who's like, I'm 200 feet, there shouldn't be one or something, you need to have some kind of justification for that.
Yeah, and I like using the parcel boundary just because that seems fair all the way around.
Mhm.
That's 150 feet from this parcel's boundary. It's not highlighted the more nifty like Michelle knows how to do, but it's getting to the point here.
Yeah, and that to me, that sounds like a short distance, but when you look at it on the map there, that looks like a reasonable thing.
I like that too, because I mean, it's picking up the adjacent properties and it's picking up the properties across the street. So it's kind of doing what we were saying adjacent would do.
Yeah.
And it doesn't leave anybody stuck in the middle of, stuck between two short-term rentals.
I like that, and combined with a total maximum number. And I'm proposing that, let's assume that there's 900 single-family residences in the historic district. And if we were looking at, say, 5% of that number, that would be a maximum of 45. 2% would be whatever it would be.
18.
18, whatever. I think some number in that range would be reasonable together with this 150-foot circle. Yeah.
Okay.
That's as thoughtful as I can be on the number, Greg.
Yeah, no, thanks. Can you change it back to the face view for me, Carl?
You get rid of this circle, you mean?
No, just get rid of the screen share.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
So how the rest of you feel after seeing that last map?
Greg, I'm good with that 150-foot limitation. And I also like the suggestion that was made that we have a certain number, but we could also use that as a percentage of the number of properties in the historic district. I think with GIS planning could probably get a count of that for us. And I would be good with anything between 2 and 5%.
So we would want to know the number of, I don't know what the right term is, single family residences or domiciles, or what would be the right thing that we're looking for, Carl or Jeremy?
They would be single family residences. Yeah, SFRs.
Okay. Yeah, 45 seems like a big number to me, even though, if you look at the whole historic district, but that feels too high to me. But what do the rest of you think? We've heard from Tom and John.
Yeah, based on what Jeremy said, though, I'm moving on the idea that it's less than 900 SFRs. And the smaller that number, then 5% looks a little bit better.
Commissioner Soltis?
Yeah, I like the 150 circle. It gets answers the adjacent question well, and we can be very consistent with that. I like a lower percentage rather than the 5, and I would suggest that maybe there's something in the literature that other cities have picked, have set on a different number that we may be able to glean off of their experience. So maybe there's something in the documentation that they've set a limit by percentage or by a total number. But I'm thinking lower. I think 45 is too high, depending on what your methodology was. 25 maybe is more in the range I would be thinking of for that area.
Okay. Commissioner Bennett?
I think I am in agreement that 45 does feel like too much. I'm trying to picture some kind of even spacing of these things within the historic district, and thinking, okay, you can have some on the edge of the historic district, which might, would space them out in terms of having 45 neatly in there. So the 45 number is coming from a percentage, but then the 150 feet might not actually yield 45, depending on the actual acreage or size or whatever of the historic district. So I'm kind of curious, if you were to put 100 to try to figure out how many you could actually get physically within that space, is that going to be closer to a 25 or a 30 or something like that? I don't know how you would figure that out in terms of where they might be located, especially if they were on the fringes or the edges or something like that. But I also get the feeling that 45 feels like too much.
And when you're saying 45, you guys are saying 45 units, and you're just basing that on a percentage of
Off of 900.
Of the 900, yeah.
900 parcels.
45 permits, I guess, is what, when we say 45, I'm thinking 45 permits.
Right. That's right.
Okay. So to Commissioner Bennett's point here, I'll just share this really quick. Here's the historic district again.
Webinar.
This is that 150. Foot circle. So I think that gives you kind of an idea of how, how many there could be. A little bit better. I mean, considering that we've got some areas where there really aren't any as single family residences, no single family, no single family, no single family, no single family. No single family through on this side, and up here, there's a couple in here. No single family. Up here, then you get back into some single family again.
Yeah, it's interesting, just by fat fingering it here real quickly, it comes up to right around 20. Although, again, as Amanda's pointed out, if you have one right at the very edge, then, so I think that, having said that, with that, we may not even need a number restriction in the historic district if we go with this 150 foot limitation, and then it's just one less thing to have to worry about.
I think you're right, Greg. I think looking at that, you're not going to get 45 parcels in there anyway, so it may be sufficient just to leave it at 150 feet.
I agree with that assessment.
I do too.
Me too.
I do too.
All right, victory.
So I'm sorry, I was
Hold on.
It's the 150 feet.
Commissioner Soltis, you have your hand up?
Oh, I'm sorry, that's residual land.
Okay.
okay, so 150 feet, no limitation on the number of permits that can be issued.
Right.
And so is that 150 feet, are we talking citywide? Or are we just talking about historic district? Because originally we were kind of talking about separating the two. Sorry, I know I'm just throwing another wrench in things.
We're
But-
just comfortable with them. You
Sorry.
messed it up.
That's what I do.
Well, why not apply to the whole city? We're most concerned about the historic district, but the 150 kind of protects that. Why wouldn't we want to protect the rest of the neighborhoods as well if that's an issue for the historic district? Why not go citywide?
I
agree,
concur.
Bob. Yeah.
I'm sorry, what did you, I heard Larry, but I didn't hear what you said, John.
I was going to agree. It seems to work for the whole city.
I see Amanda nodding as well, and Shannon and Tom. Okay.
Yeah.
Because that captures Finholm now too. The upper part of Finholm, if you did the whole city like that. And
Zoom webinar.
Okay, 150 feet citywide I've got in there. So I got a couple things maybe, Chair, let me come back really quick. We should discuss here. So we're at 7:45. I know that, and Michelle, I have the same issue. Jeremy, do you have a shutdown warning on your computer for a restart?
I did not receive one. Mine shut
Okay.
down yesterday in my backpack, so I think I'm all right.
Okay.
Yeah, I made you both co-hosts just in case.
Okay, so
So if
mine.
I get kicked out, we're not in the meeting.
This will be the last time, though. I just would like to let Planning Commission know we've talked to our tech folks, and they're going to change that so that this won't happen anymore. But it is going to happen to Michelle and I here. Mine's going to happen at about 8:11. That said, if we go past 8 o'clock, Chair, I think there has to be a motion and a vote to
Yes.
extend the meeting past 8 o'clock anyway.
Yeah, why don't we, I think there's a few more things here that we'll be able to knock out pretty quickly. So let's
Okay.
bang and
Will do. Maximum number of tenants an STR may house. Last time we talked about this a little bit, we were talking about the fact that adult family homes allow for 6 residents total. So there was a slight comparison that we were making there. And then another consideration here is whether the occupancy, if we did impose an occupancy limitation on tenants, would that also include the permanent residents? And another question in that, I suppose, is do we even want to have something like that?
I would vote not to go down that road. It would be impossible to enforce.
yeah. I think you went fuzzy there, Larry, but I think you said it would be impossible to enforce, or is that what you?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Other thoughts?
I saw consistently used quite a bit was 2 people per permitted bedroom.
Mhm.
I'm just throwing that out there as a starting point, and that seemed pretty fair, but
What I saw more specifically was 2 adults and 2 children, up to 2 children per permitted bedroom.
That's
I
what the
think-
Gig Harbor Alliance said too.
And I think doing it on a per bedroom basis makes sense, because whether you're talking about a whole house rental versus a single room versus an ADU is going to vary greatly. That you wouldn't really want to limit it on a per unit basis other than perhaps bedrooms.
There's an area where I think self-policing comes into play.
Mhm.
If somebody is going to pay $2,000 to rent a house per week, it's hard for me to imagine that they would put 8 people into a bedroom. They would want to, in other words, self-police, live pretty much like they would at home.
Well, yeah. Although that's assuming there's never a bachelor or bachelorette party in Gig Harbor. And it would be easy for me to see a scenario where a bunch of young folks all chipped in together to buy a big fancy $2,000 house for the wedding.
And squeeze as many people in as you possibly can.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very
certainly
common.
that is the kind of scenario that we're concerned about.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I guess it's related to me as well to the parking situation. So because if you're renting out 4 bedrooms and you can have 2 people in each bedroom, and so most of the time there's going to be 1 car, for each of those bedrooms. then you have the potential to have 4 extra cars, at a house, including the owner's car. So I guess it goes to partly it's related to what are the requirements going to be for off-street parking. So as was suggested, the Alliance, I think, suggested that a maximum of 2 adults and 2 kids per room. And I think that's a reasonable and good number. I think that you see that frequently in travels if you've ever used an Airbnb. But it does tie into parking.
I was just bringing that up here too, Chair. Parking's covered a little bit later, and the note we made was that lodging level 1 presently requires 1.125 spaces for each room rented, in addition to the 2 required spaces for single family.
And shouldn't we also be discussing the number of bedrooms that can be rented? And don't we see from our research that's usually limited to 2?
When they're not renting out the whole home. So for those other 9 months out of the year, we're saying then they would only be able to rent out 2 or whatever rooms.
Well, I think there should be a limitation, and the typical limitation is 2 bedrooms, yeah.
So older couple, kids out of the house, love where they live, 4 or 5 bedroom home, love interacting with people, want to start doing STRs. Maybe for fun, maybe because they need the income. Is there a reason we would limit them to only renting 2 of their bedrooms instead of 3 of their bedrooms?
Parking, traffic.
I'm not sure parking and traffic is a good enough, because when that couple's children were there, if they had 4 kids, they could have easily had 4 or 5 cars at their home at that time. That's what our neighbors have. But it doesn't seem like it would be any more. Like the bedrooms would be relatively commensurate, and if you've got the parking space on site for that many vehicles, why would you limit it?
I've got to go back to the Gig Harbor Alliance definitions. I thought they were pretty solid in terms of maximums for 2 guests per bedroom plus children. That's a good one, I think. And their parking one was pretty good too. Each SDR shall provide 1 off-street parking space for every 2 rental bedrooms or portions thereof. I don't quite know how that compares to the city existing one. I think it was 1.25, Carl, or something like that.
For a bed and breakfast for lodging level 1, 1.25 for each bedroom.
But it does lay some requirements out that they have to have X amount of off-street parking spaces depending upon the number of bedrooms they're renting. So I thought that was pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
I'm having a hard time, Tom, seeing how we could justify holding it to only 2 bedrooms, because there are some big houses around here.
I think that's typical. That's typical across other states, other cities. We've seen that from our research.
Okay.
And
that's the only.
I was going to note also then, if we're talking about bedrooms, we do have to keep in mind the accessory dwelling units as well, which are typically, a studio for the most part. Is that counted as 1 bedroom if they're renting that out?
Yeah.
We also have separate permitting that would be going into an accessory apartment, right? They would have to be showing, they would be doing all of the concurrency review and everything when that accessory apartment is actually permitted, and there would be parking associated with that accessory apartment already as well. Parking, I think, again, I think it in my mind, kind of does come back to what Commissioner Bennett was saying, that it is not going to be, likely not going to be that much different than a 4-person family. In some cases, maybe a little bit more, but I would say it wouldn't be 100% of the time. Some families have 6 people. I mean, I've seen some houses in my neighborhood where I know they've got a few kids, that are high school age, or kids staying with them or whatever. They've got cars piled up all over the place. Not saying that's what we want, obviously, but it's not uncommon and it's not abnormal in a single family neighborhood to see that kind of thing happen. The bottom line is that they have to have some off-street parking just because it's a single family home. We require them to have some off-street parking already. And so I think the question becomes, if they are changing that use, or they're adding that use to their single family residential home, which is the short-term rental, should they have to provide some additional off-street parking just for that use? And could that just be some flat number, 1 or 2 stalls or something? Just so there's some parking accounted for. There's obviously going to be at least 1 additional car whenever they're renting the place out, because everybody drives.
So in California, St. Helena, they called out 2 on-site parking spaces. I mean, just as a starting point, that seems pretty reasonable.
If they have an STR, no matter what goes on in there, a minimum of 2.
Right. And I think that's the key, a minimum of 2 on-site parking spaces.
Parking can become a limiting factor. Perhaps somebody wants to, in essence, turn their entire front yard into a parking lot where they would provide 4 spaces. But neighborhood restrictions would not permit that. So that could become a kind of a built-in restriction on the number of people who could be living in a house at any given time.
Well, I know we've been at it a long time. Let's kind of try to grind through it and get this decision made before 8 o'clock.
I like 2 parking spaces per STR.
I can go with that.
Well, is it, what if we said a minimum of 2, but off-street parking must be provided for all guests?
Well, you don't want to go there, because in many areas, off-street parking is not permitted, or it's restricted to certain hours.
You mean on-street parking, Commissioner Bradbury?
Yes, on street.
Hmm.
Off premises.
Well, I think where the chair was going with that, I think, Chair, you're saying that if you're running a short-term rental, you can have no parking spill out onto the street. So it would be 0 on-street parking. Everything would have to be contained on your site and managed otherwise. And that could be an enforcement situation. It might come up under review when we're looking at your business license on that annual review. Again, could be a check against you.
Yeah.
I think think that sounds fair because that allows for the variation and all the possibilities for what would be renting out versus a whole house or a room without being too restrictive. I think it just covers what needs to get covered.
So rather than putting a number on it at all, Commissioner Bennett, or are you saying that we require 2 additional spaces for an STR and then anything, any nuisance beyond that would then be an enforcement issue?
Yeah, I think what Chair had said and not giving it a number and just saying enough for the amount of people who are there. Whether you have a 2-seater car or an 8-seater car, there's so many different variables that can happen with how many people you're bringing in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, is that all right with everybody?
Yes.
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 All right,
Yes.
sounds good.
Okay, so
Okay.
that's,
That was
So-
parking.
Yeah, so why don't you bring the list up, Carl, and I just want people to see it. It is 8 o'clock. So in order to
Zoom
continue,
webinar.
we would have to have a motion to continue the meeting. Otherwise, we would adjourn. And there is the work that we have left.
yeah, we didn't get this one covered. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to go. Oh, actually, no, just 6, because we actually answered this one before.
We do have the option to have a meeting the 28th if we want to finish this up on the 28th.
Is fractional ownership on that list, Carl?
Yeah, no, it is not. I think Commissioner Brown, that we would probably end up covering fractional ownership within the definition of short-term rental and or what's prohibited.
All right.
So one option would be to just, send the table out to folks. Then you could all look and make sure that we haven't forgotten anything that you felt was important, because we try to capture everything from all of the input from everybody previously. And then, have a meeting, which shouldn't be take anywhere near as much time. But it is 8 o'clock and like I said, we would need a motion to continue this meeting now.
I like that suggestion, Greg.
Same here.
I'm flexible. I could go longer if you guys wanted to, but it sounds like we don't have any more energy. But there's some pretty easy questions in the last 7 of them. We could do a couple of those pretty quick. Like
Maybe.
hours and things like that.
I think I like the idea of having the chart and seeing the questions that are still left, and then us all thinking about them and going from there. I feel like I'm losing productivity here.
Yeah, I think the energy, and I would like the energy in the room is flagging, so I can feel it all over Gig Harbor. There's dark clouds and rainstorms or something going on. I don't know what it is.
I can smell the pizza.
Well, that's as good as any. Well, hearing no motion to continue the meeting, then just quickly, Carl, next business.
Well, the next regular meeting would be May 5th. And of course, we had planned to talk about short-term rentals at that meeting. And I guess the question is whether or not we want to have a special meeting on the 28th to finish this discussion off in hopes of maybe bringing back a draft ordinance on the 5th at a regular meeting. Because if we can do that, then we're feeling good about it, we could potentially get to a hearing May 19th. Is really ambitious, but it's possible. Now that I say that, I'm thinking that's impossible, but it's not impossible. We can do these things. Part of the pressure here is that the council has requested that we do our level best to get an ordinance to them by June 13th for first reading.
Yeah.
So that's the reason for this sort of expedited, but I feel like we're getting there. This is feeling pretty good in my view, but again, that's up to planning commission whether or not you feel like an extra meeting is within your purview. Or
I think an extra meeting is a good thing. I mean, I don't like too much time going between these different discussions. I like if we can kind of continue the momentum we had going. So adding an extra meeting for me would be fine.
I'm available on the 28th as well. I will not be available on the 19th of May. I will be out to sea.
sounds
I can do
nice.
the 28th.
Okay. Is that okay with everybody? Because I'm fine for a meeting, and it should be efficient and helpful, and not only to meet the council's desired, but we do have people that are hanging in limbo with permits and in the process, and I think we owe it to them to try to get this moving along as quickly as possible, so I would like to have that meeting and anticipate it wouldn't take us very long.
I can't do the 28th, but can I take what's left in there and I can write up my 2 cents worth to provide to you guys just to give some consideration to?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, that'd be great.
Larry, are you good next week?
I believe I am. I would have to consult the schedule in the next room, but I think I'm okay.
Okay. All right, folks, then I shall call the meeting. I open the floor for a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Move to adjourn.
I second that.
She said emphatically. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Motion passes unanimously. The planning commission meeting is adjourned at 8:07 p.m. Thank you very much, everybody.
Have a good evening.
Discussion, everybody.